Many people go to the pawn shop, trying to sell their old belongings for a bit of money. So it wasn't unusual for store owner Victor when Tommy walked through the door with an old book in his hands. However, what was unusual was the book itself. Victor glanced at the book and immediately knew they were dealing with something very important. Victor told the young boy he wasn't supposed to have that book, but his response was surprising. As Tommy looked at the book he was holding in his hands, he decided that he wanted to keep it. He had been helping his grandma clean out the attic, and he had found many special things, but there was something different about this book. Tommy couldn't forget about this book, and he just knew that there was something special about it. He decided that he needed an expert to take a look at it, so he went to the pawn shop in hopes of finding out more about the book. But he had no idea it would be something this huge. When the expert explained what this book really was, Tommy's eyes widened in disbelief. He was left completely speechless. He just could not believe it. What did Tommy find out about the book? Why was it so special? And how did it end up in Grandma Alice's attic? Tommy sat in the garden, enjoying the sun while he was having some ice cream with his grandma. It was the middle of the summer holiday, and he had been helping his grandma clean out the attic in her house. While cleaning it, they found many interesting things. Ever since Grandma's husband, Tommy's grandpa Glenn, had passed away, Grandma Alice hadn't set foot in the attic anymore. She couldn't walk up the stairs easily, and she hadn't needed anything from the attic anyway. Now she had decided to move into a retirement home after the summer, and she had asked Tommy to help her clean up a bit. Most of the things they had found could be thrown away or donated to charity or second-hand shops. Clothes, shoes, toys, games, dishes, kitchen utensils, etc. But while helping his grandma, Tommy spotted a couple of very interesting items that he was interested in keeping himself. Grandma Alice had given him a box that he could use to collect the things he wanted to keep. She didn't mind at all. She just enjoyed spending time with her grandson, and she was even happy that he took an interest in the old and dusty things she and Grandpa Glenn had gathered in their attic over the years. It was almost the end of the summer holiday when Grandma Alice sold the house and moved into the retirement home. Tommy had enjoyed spending time with her, and he had learned a lot about her past. She had told him many stories about the various objects they'd come across in the attic. But those stories weren't all he was left with. Tommy still had the box of items he had gathered to keep. He had put it under his bed, and he had even forgotten about it for a while, until one day when he was cleaning his room and came across it again. He decided to have another look at all the things he had gathered. Among them were old photo albums, with many photos of his grandparents when they were younger, a couple of DVDs, and some of Tommy's old toys from when he was little. And there was one other item that had caught his eye while cleaning the attic: a book. The book was probably the oldest thing they had found in the attic, Tommy thought. As soon as he had spotted it in the back of a dusty drawer, it had caught his interest, and he wanted to see what was written inside it. He had never seen anything like it before. But to Tommy's disappointment, the ink had faded away. He couldn't make out a single word of what was written on the pages. Some of the illustrations were still visible, but he didn't know what they meant. Since he couldn't read the book, Tommy didn't really know what to do with it. When he asked his grandma about the book, she could not tell him anything useful. She admitted that she did not really know what it was either. It had been passed on from generation to generation in her family, and she was more than happy to pass it on to Tommy now. Tommy wanted to try to find some information about this book online, but he didn't even know where to start. He couldn't decipher anything that was written in or on the book, so he wouldn't get far. But luckily, he was not someone who gave up easily. Since the illustrations were the most intact parts of the book, Tommy decided to start from there. He spent hours behind his computer, looking for anything he could find about the images or the book itself. But the illustrations were also a bit vague and, sadly, not very distinct. He was slowly becoming desperate when suddenly he found something. Tommy gasped and his mouth fell open while he was reading the article. He couldn't believe what he was looking at. He must be imagining things. He took another close look at the photo on his computer screen and he compared it to the book, and there was no doubt. It was an exact match. Tommy couldn't contain his excitement. Could this really be happening? He decided that he could not be 100% sure of it yet. First, he needed to find a way to confirm that this book was indeed what he thought it was. And he knew just the right place for that. He carefully put the book in a bag and hopped on his bike. He raced across town as fast as he could. He was so excited about what he had discovered. A couple of minutes later, Tommy was a little out of breath, but he had finally arrived at his destination, the pawn shop. Once he entered the shop, the owner, Victor, greeted him. When Tommy told the man what he had brought with him, he just sighed and rolled his eyes in response. "I don't have time for this," he told Tommy. It was obvious that the owner didn't believe him. Tommy almost started doubting himself. It wasn't that crazy that the man didn't believe him, anyway. He probably wouldn't have believed himself either. But Tommy was determined, and he would not just let Victor send him away. He needed answers, and he would not leave without them. Even if the book wasn't what he thought it was, at least he would know the truth. So, Tommy carefully took the book out of his bag and placed it on the counter. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief as he looked at it, and then at Tommy. "Where did you get this book?" he asked him. "It belonged to my grandmother," Tommy replied. Victor told him to wait there, and he quickly went into his office. Tommy could hear him speaking to someone on the phone. "Yes, I'm serious. Get over here as soon as you can. You need to take a look at this." Victor returned to the counter and asked Tommy to wait there. He told him he had called an expert to come and check out the book and said she would be here soon. Tommy was in no hurry to return home, and he actually found the whole thing very exciting. Victor kept looking at Tommy and the book, and it was obvious that he didn't understand how this book ended up in some kid's hands. "Are you sure this book belonged to your grandma? Where did she get it?" he asked Tommy. While they waited for the expert, Tommy explained everything to him. Pretty soon, the expert arrived at the shop. She said she had come as soon as she could, and she asked if she could take a look at the book. Tommy told her that, of course, she could. He tried his best to hide that he was actually a bit nervous about what she would tell him. As the expert was checking out the book, Tommy and Victor observed her and waited in silence. She had a very serious look on her face, and they couldn't tell what she was thinking at all. Tommy almost began to doubt himself again when she finally turned and spoke to him. "You're not supposed to have this book," she said, with a very serious look on her face. Tommy was confused. He had found some information about this book online, but he still did not really know what it was. This seemed to be a lot more serious than he had expected. He waited for the expert to explain what was going on, but she remained silent. He just looked at Tommy, then at the book, and then back at Tommy again. Suddenly, she told him something that he had not seen coming. "Kid, you need to leave." Okay, Tommy said. "Aren't you going to tell me what's the deal with this book?" he asked her. But the woman had turned away from him already, and she appeared to be making a phone call. He was about to grab the book and walk away when she yelled at him, "Let me stop you right there. I'll be taking that book with me, thank you." "Now, feel free to leave," the expert said as she gestured toward the door. Tommy was at a loss for words. What was going on? He wasn't going to just leave his book there. Even though his grandma had let Tommy take the book, It rightfully belonged to her. He was not just going to leave it here. But he didn't know what to do. The expert had already taken the book into a back room with her, and she had closed the door. He needed to think of a plan to get it back. He pleadingly looked at Victor, but he just shrugged his shoulders and went back to organizing some papers behind his desk. He was of no help. Tommy needed to handle this on his own. He walked back and forth through the shop, thinking of the best way to approach the situation. He could ask the woman again nicely to give him back his book, but he doubted that would work. He could try to fight her for it, but he wasn't sure if he would win that fight. However, there was one thing that worked in his favor. He was definitely faster than the woman. She was wearing heels, and he was in his sneakers. His best shot would probably be to run into that room, grab the book, and run away. She would never be able to catch up with him. He decided that this was it. He knew what he had to do now. Tommy stood still and looked around the shop to check whether anyone was paying attention to him, but Victor was busy with his papers, and there were no other customers. He took a few deep breaths and prepared himself for what he was about to do as he slowly walked toward the door. He stood right in front of it and heard the woman speaking to someone on the phone. This was great, he thought. She would probably be distracted, and she would not even realize what was happening at first. This would give him enough time to take what was his and make a run for it. His heart was beating in his chest as he put one hand on the door handle. He had to do it now. But just as he was about to open the door, something unexpected happened. Something that completely ruined his plan and his chances of taking the book home. The front door swung open, and two men walked through it. By their looks, Tommy assumed that they were probably not just customers. They both wore suits and had a security earpieces on. And it wasn't long before Tommy realized why they had come to the shop. His hand was still on the doorknob when suddenly the door opened. He stood face to face with the expert who had taken his book, but she just said, "Why are you still here? I thought I told you to leave." And she immediately walked to the guards who had just walked into the shop. She must have called them in. "There you are. It took you long enough. Here is the book. Victor was right about it. Take it to the lab for testing immediately and tell Dr. Roberts to call me as soon as he has the results. I don't want to miss a single update. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some other business to attend to." And the door slowly fell close behind her. She had gone away, and she had left the book with the guards, and all of Tommy's hopes of bringing the book back home with him just shattered. He knew these guards would never just hand it over to him, and there was no way he could outrun or fight them. And seeing as they were double his size, he would prefer not to fight them anyway. He watched them from a distance as they nodded to Victor as a way of greeting him, and they turned around and walked out the door. Just like that, the book was gone, and the expert had left Tommy even more confused than he already was. Why had she called in these guards to take care of the book? And what did she need to get it tested for? Tommy realized that this nook must be a lot more special than he even thought. But why? What was so special about it? All Tommy knew was that he needed to think of another plan to get it back. But he had no idea where to start. He didn't even know the woman's name. But luckily, he remembered that she had mentioned something to the guards about a lab and someone named Dr. Roberts. He didn't have much to work with, but at least he had something, and something was better than nothing. He walked outside and hopped back on his bike, ready to go home. The entire way home, he thought about the best way to track down the book, or this Dr. Roberts. Since he didn't have much to go on, he decided that he would start by looking at what he could find online. He went back to the article he had previously found about the book in hopes of finding something useful there. Maybe he had overlooked something. He read it over and over again, but sadly, he found nothing that could lead him to where the book was now. But he was not going to give up. He also checked all the comments below the article, and after a while, he suddenly stopped scrolling. He had almost missed it. But there was something that caught his attention. Would this finally bring him one step closer to the truth? Or was it just a coincidence? As he was reading through the comments below the article, he came across something very interesting. It might be a bit far-fetched, but in one of the comments, Tommy saw something that he just could not ignore. One of the users mentioned LR's research, and this immediately rang a bell. As soon as Tommy saw this, he thought of what the expert had said to the guards in the shop, Dr. Roberts, and testing something in a lab. What if, and he knew the chances were minimal, but still, this LR referred to Dr. Roberts? They would certainly be doing some kind of research in the lab the expert had mentioned, right? Tommy decided to check the user profile of the person who had posted that comment. This way, he could see any other comments the user had posted on other articles. And sure enough, it proved to be a good call. He saw that the user had posted hundreds of comments. He would definitely find something useful here. He searched for any other comments that mentioned this LR, and there were tons of them. He was getting excited, but he didn't want to celebrate just yet. Maybe this would lead him to some answers, but it was also possible that this was a false lead. He read through some more of the comments, and he finally spotted something that made him blink twice. The user mentioned that LR was doing some work in a laboratory in a museum in the same city as where Tommy lived. Was it possible that this was the Dr. Roberts the expert had mentioned? And would this be where they had taken his book? Tommy knew that he could not ignore this. He quickly looked up the opening times of the museum online, and he saw that he still had a couple of hours before it would close. He hopped on his bike again and raced over to the museum. He was getting closer. He just felt it. Once he got there, he tried his best not to raise any suspicion. Luckily for him, it was very busy, and many parents were there with their children. He blended right in. He bought a ticket and went inside, ready to look around and find out where the lab was. He walked around for a bit and enjoyed seeing all the ancient artifacts. He almost forgot what he was there for. When he arrived at the section with all the old books and manuscripts, he finally remembered what he had come for, and he noticed something that truly amazed him. Among the books that were exhibited in the museum, he saw one book that looked exactly like the book he had gotten from his grandma. It even had the same pictures. But on the information sign next to it, it said that this book was centuries old. Tommy thought it was just a crazy coincidence that it looked exactly like his book, and he continued his search. As he walked around, he noticed a door that said, "Employees Only." Usually, he would have walked right past it without even paying any attention to it. But now, it was just the thing that drew him closer. He just knew that he had to sneak through that door. He looked around to see if anybody was watching him, and when he felt that the coast was clear, he quickly opened the door and went inside. He held his breath, not knowing what he would find behind it. But luckily, he had walked into an empty hallway. Where did he need to go from here? He had no idea. He decided to walk around and check all the doors that were there. This might take a while, and he hoped that nobody else would come in while he was there. If that happened, he would never be able to get that book back. He stood before the first door, gathering the courage to open it. He had already come this far. He should not give up now. He was a bit scared, but he decided to continue. He needed to be careful, but he also needed to hurry. he didn't have forever. He quickly opened the first door and he saw a little room filled with cleaning supplies. This must be the janitor's closet, he thought to himself. Moving on to the next door, he opened it and walked into a little kitchen with a few dining tables in the room. This had to be the break room. He was just about to walk to the third door when he heard voices coming from behind him. Oh no! If anybody saw him here, they would definitely send him away immediately. He needed to find a solution quickly. Luckily, he thought of a good place to hide. He ran back to the janitor's closet and quickly slid inside. He hid behind a basket filled with old cleaning rags. He just hoped that whoever was out there would not need these rags. He held his breath while he listened to the voices. There was nothing he could do now but wait. He breathed a sigh of relief when the voices faded away until they disappeared. His plan was not ruined yet. He still had a chance of finding the book. And even though he was so focused on it, he still had no idea how important the book would prove to be. He quietly opened the door to the janitor's closet and peeked through inside the hallway. When he saw that it was empty, he quickly stepped outside and walked toward the third door. As he grabbed the handle to pull it open, he noticed that it wasn't moving. This door was locked. Tommy saw that there was a lock next to the door. He needed a security code to get inside. This was going to be more difficult than he thought. As he looked around, he saw that there was a little window in the door, but it was too far up for him to look through it. He needed to see what was in that room. Luckily, Tommy was a smart kid. He remembered he had seen a little footstool in the janitor's closet. If he could stand on that, he would definitely be able to look through the window. And so, he grabbed the stool and climbed on it. When he looked through the window, he gasped. Behind that door was a lab, and he thought he saw his book right there on the table. He hadn't been able to look through the window for long because he was afraid that someone would see him. But now, he finally knew that he was on the right track. He decided that he needed to peek through that window at least once more. If he wanted to get his book back, he needed to know more about what was going on in that room. So, he took a deep breath and got back up on the stool, hoping that nobody would see him. As he looked through the window another time, he noticed something that gave him hope. There appeared to be only one person inside the lab. Was that the Dr. Roberts the expert had mentioned? Either way, Tommy didn't care. All he cared about was his book, and he was finally going to take it back. He thought of a plan. He was going to wait for the scientist to walk out the door, and just before it closed, he would sneak into the lab. Of course, his plan required a lot of luck to even work. But there was nothing else Tommy could do. He did not know the code, and he needed to get inside without that man seeing him. Luckily for him, it didn't take long before the man took off his security glasses and gloves. From what Tommy could see, he assumed that the man would come outside any minute now. So, he quickly put the stool back in the janitor's office and hid next to the door. His heart was beating in his chest as he waited. The seconds crept by, and Tommy was getting increasingly nervous. What if his plan didn't work? This was not the time to worry about it. He needed to focus now. He closed his eyes as he waited for the door to open. And when it did, he needed to react quickly. Seconds later, he heard a beep. And sure enough, the door swung open. The old man walked past him right into the break room. He had definitely not seen Tommy hiding behind the door. Tommy saw his chance and quickly, behind the man's back, ran into the lab. His plan worked. He did it. He was finally inside. He walked over to the book and looked at what the man had been doing. He did not understand. He took a closer look at all the notes he had made, and he gasped. Was this really true? It couldn't be. Tommy was so shocked that he continued flipping through the notes the man had taken. He was so invested that he had not even heard the door behind him open and close. He only realized that he wasn't alone in the room when he heard a shrug behind him. He was startled, and he looked behind him, only to see that the scientist was back inside the lab now. It was over. He had been caught. He expected the man to be angry or to scold him, but instead, the man just looked at him with a curious expression. "Quite impressive, isn't it?" he said. Tommy was surprised by this reaction. He had broken into a restricted area after all. But he wasn't going to point this out to the man, in case he didn't realize it yet. Instead, he just replied, "I don't understand. What is so special about this book?" And the man started laughing. "Well, what isn't special about it?" he replied. Tommy desperately wanted some answers, and he hoped that this man would finally tell him what was going on with this book and why people were acting so strange around it. He really wanted to know. Tommy found out that this man was, indeed, Dr. Roberts, and luckily, he was much nicer than the expert, Ms. Clark. Dr. Roberts explained everything that was so special about this book and why his team wanted to research it. He was surprised to find out that Tommy was the one who had found it, but he wanted to make a deal. If Tommy left the book with him and let him continue his research, Dr. Roberts would make sure that Tommy and his grandma received the credit for it once he was done. They were the ones who had brought the book to their attention, after all. What would Tommy say to this? Once he realized how special this book was and how important it was to research it, he agreed to leave it with Dr. Roberts at the lab. Luckily for him, Dr. Roberts understood why he had gone through all the trouble to return his book, and he let him go without reporting him to the museum guards. Tommy couldn't believe what he had found out about the book. How bizarre was it that such a special item with such a rich history had ended up in his grandmother's attic? It had been there for years, collecting dust, and nobody even had an idea of its great importance. They had all just thought that it was some family heirloom. Tommy was amazed by what he had learned, and he couldn't stop thinking about his grandma. He couldn't wait to tell her about it. He quickly biked to the retirement home where she lived now. She was surprised to see him, but when he explained why he had come to visit unannounced, she gasped. Dr. Roberts had told Tommy that the book was very rare and ancient, and of great historical and cultural value. After finishing his research on it, it would get its own spot in the museum. And because Tommy played such an important role in getting it there, he would receive free entry to the museum for the rest of his life. Grandma Alice was surprised to hear all of this. She had just assumed that the book was a family heirloom, and she had no idea that it was so much more than that. She was happy that it got a place at the local museum so that others could learn from it and appreciate its significance.